The pouch opened slowly, the worn leather creasing like it remembered every hand that had ever held it. And inside there was no advanced tool, no polished instrument, just a small, weathered wrench and a strip of dull metal that looked like it belonged to another lifetime. Captain Hayes let out a short laugh, shaking his head as he glanced at his crew. "That is what you brought to fix a $30 million aircraft." The words drew quiet snickers, but they faded quicker this time, because Dalton did not answer. He never answered. He simply stepped closer to the side panel, his fingers moving with a certainty that did not belong to guesswork. He traced the edge of the plate, paused, then pressed gently against a single corner, not hard, just enough to feel something beneath the surface. His eyes narrowed again, and for a brief moment, the present seemed to slip, the heat of the runway replaced by something older, heavier, the distant echo of engines that did not sound healthy but desperate, fighting to stay alive. Dalton's grip tightened slightly on the small wrench as if it carried memory, not function, and when he blinked, the runway came back. The crew, the aircraft, the silence, all of it waiting. Airman Lucas Reed shifted uneasily near the equipment cart, his gaze fixed on Dalton. Something about the way the old man moved did not match the situation. It was not hesitation, it was recognition. Like he had seen this exact failure before. Hayes crossed his arms tighter, impatience creeping into his posture. "You are wasting time," he said, but his voice lacked the same edge it had before, because Dalton had already begun. The panel screws turned one by one, slow, deliberate, no wasted motion, no second guesses. The metal plate came loose, revealing a section that every diagnostic had cleared, untouched, ignored, perfect on every screen. Dalton leaned in slightly, not rushing, just looking, really looking, his head tilted as if listening again. Then he reached in and adjusted something so small it almost disappeared between his fingers, a fraction of movement, a correction no system had flagged. Reed felt a chill run through him despite the heat, because the entire crew had been staring at that aircraft for hours and none of them had seen it. Not one. Hayes stepped forward now, closer than before, eyes locked on Dalton's hands. Watching, waiting for failure, for nothing to happen, for the moment to collapse into embarrassment. But Dalton did not look back. He secured the panel again, tightened the screws with the same quiet precision, then stepped away from the aircraft, just one step, as if giving it space, as if whatever came next did not belong to him anymore. The runway held its breath again. The heat shimmered, the flags barely moved, and then Dalton reached up and flipped a single switch inside the cockpit. No hesitation, no build-up, just one motion. And for a second, nothing happened, absolutely nothing. The silence stretched thin, ready to snap. Hayes almost smirked, almost spoke, but then it came, low at first, so low it could have been mistaken for wind. A vibration that traveled through the metal skin of the aircraft, rising, building, deepening into something unmistakable. The first engine began to turn, slow, reluctant, then stronger, louder, the sound rolling across the runway like distant thunder. Reed's eyes widened. Someone took a step back. Another crew member dropped his tablet without realizing it. And before anyone could process it, the second engine followed, igniting with a force that shattered the silence completely. The roar filled the air, raw and undeniable, and every man standing there knew in that instant that something impossible had just happened. The roar did not just fill the runway. It pressed against every chest, a deep, rolling force that silenced every voice and every doubt in an instant. Captain Hayes stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, the confidence that once defined him now hanging loose, uncertain, like he had just stepped into something far beyond his control. The engineers stared at their screens, then back at the aircraft, then back at Dalton, trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with everything they thought they knew. But the numbers no longer mattered, the diagnostics no longer meant anything, because the machine was alive, and it was alive because of the one thing they had all dismissed, experience. Dalton did not react to the noise, did not turn to claim attention or recognition. He simply watched the engine stabilize, listening to the rhythm, as if confirming something only he could hear. Airman Reed felt his pulse quicken, his instincts telling him that this moment was not just rare, it was significant, something bigger than a simple fix, something that required someone higher to see it. His hand moved almost on its own, reaching for his phone, stepping back from the others, his voice low as he made the call. Careful, controlled, but urgent. He did not explain everything. He did not need to. He only said the name, Frank Dalton, and that was enough, because on the other end, silence followed, then a sharp shift in tone, questions that came too fast, too focused. Reed answered what he could, his eyes still locked on the old man standing quietly beside the now roaring aircraft. And within seconds, the line ended, not with dismissal, but with action. Back on the runway, Hayes finally found his voice. "What did you do?" he asked. But it was not a challenge anymore. It was a question, uncertain, almost cautious. Dalton did not answer. He never answered. He just reached up and rested his hand briefly against the aircraft again, as if acknowledging it, then stepped away, giving it back to the men who thought they understood it. The engines continued to run, steady now, powerful, undeniable, the sound echoing across the base, drawing attention from farther out, heads turning, personnel stepping outside to see what had changed. And then it happened. A black staff car appeared at the far end of the runway, moving fast, faster than protocol allowed, tires cutting across the concrete with urgency that did not belong to routine inspections. The vehicle came to a sharp stop near the aircraft. The door opened immediately, and Colonel Robert Whitaker stepped out, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were searching, scanning past the aircraft, past the crew, until they landed on Dalton. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in the air, but in the people, because the colonel did not look confused. He did not look curious. He looked certain. Hayes straightened instinctively. The crew followed, tension snapping back into formation. But Whitaker did not acknowledge them. Not yet. He took a single step forward, his gaze locked on the old man. And for the first time since he arrived, the noise of the engines seemed to fade beneath something heavier, something quieter, the weight of recognition settling in before a single word was spoken. Colonel Whitaker did not rush. He did not shout. He did not even glance at the roaring aircraft behind him. His entire focus remained fixed on Frank Dalton, as if nothing else on that runway mattered. Not the crew, not the machine, not the stunned silence hanging thick in the air. He took another step forward, slow, deliberate, each movement carrying a weight that the others could feel but not yet understand. Captain Hayes felt it first, that shift in atmosphere, the kind that does not come from rank alone but from something deeper, something earned. He straightened further, instinct pulling him into attention, but Whitaker still did not acknowledge him. Not a word, not a glance. His eyes remained locked on Dalton, searching, confirming, and then, almost imperceptibly, something changed in his expression, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, clear and immediate, like seeing a name long buried suddenly brought back into the light. The colonel stopped just a few feet away, the engine still roaring behind them, the heat pressing in, but the moment felt quiet, unnaturally quiet, as if the world had narrowed to just two men standing on cracked concrete. Dalton did not move, did not speak, his posture unchanged, calm, steady, as if he had been here before, as if this exact moment had already lived somewhere in his memory. Whitaker's jaw tightened slightly, his breath slow and controlled, and then, without warning, without announcement, he raised his hand in a sharp, precise motion and held it there. A formal salute, clean and unmistakable. The effect was immediate. The crew froze. Every conversation died before it could begin. Hayes felt his chest tighten as he watched, because this was not routine. This was not protocol. This was something else entirely, something that did not happen for just anyone. Dalton did not return the salute right away. He simply looked at Whitaker, the same steady gaze, the same quiet weight, and for a second, the colonel held it, unmoving, unwavering, until Dalton finally lifted his hand, slower, less rigid, but no less meaningful, returning the gesture with a quiet authority that did not need to be displayed. It simply existed. The exchange lasted only a moment, but it carried years inside it, years that no one else on that runway could see. Whitaker lowered his hand first, stepping closer now, his voice low when he finally spoke, not for the crowd, not for the crew, but for the man in front of him. "I thought you were done," he said, and there was no accusation in it, Only something heavier, something closer to respect. Dalton's expression did not change, but there was a faint shift in his eyes, something that hinted at memory, at distance, at things left unsaid. "So did I," he replied, his voice rough but steady. The first words he had offered since stepping onto the runway, and they landed harder than anything else that had happened so far, because they carried truth, not explanation. Whitaker nodded once, a small movement, but deliberate. Then he turned slightly, just enough to face the aircraft, listening to the engines as they continued to run strong and steady. And when he looked back at Hayes, the air changed again, sharper this time, more focused, the colonel's gaze cutting through the confusion, the disbelief, the arrogance that had once filled the space. "You asked him to start it," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Hayes swallowed, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something closer to realization, something slower, heavier, because he was beginning to understand that the man he had just mocked was not just someone who knew machines. He was someone who had lived them, someone who had carried them through moments no system could measure. And standing there now, with the engines roaring behind them and the colonel watching him with quiet intensity, Hayes felt something settle deep in his chest, the unmistakable weight of being completely, undeniably wrong. The silence after the salute did not fade. It deepened, settling over the runway like something solid, something that could not be ignored or undone. Captain Hayes stood motionless, his earlier words echoing louder now in his own mind than the engines roaring behind him. And for the first time since stepping onto that tarmac, he did not feel in control. He felt exposed. Colonel Whitaker shifted his stance slightly, his presence anchoring the moment. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a calm authority that did not need to rise to be heard. "Do you know who you asked to perform for your crew?" The question was not harsh, but it landed with precision. Hayes opened his mouth, but nothing came out, because the truth was already forming and he knew it would not help him. Whitaker did not wait for an answer. He turned his gaze briefly toward the A-10, listening to the steady rhythm of the engines, then back to Dalton. "There are procedures for diagnosing failures like this," he said, almost conversational. "Systems, protocols, entire teams built around them." He paused, just long enough for the weight of that statement to settle. And yet none of that brought this aircraft back. Hayes felt the words tighten around him, not as an attack, but as a realization he could not escape. Whitaker stepped closer to Dalton, his tone lowering slightly. "You always said they would forget how to listen." There was a faint shift in Dalton's expression, not quite a smile, not quite regret. Something quieter, more distant. "They did not forget," Dalton replied, his voice steady. "They were never taught." The simplicity of the answer cut deeper than any reprimand. Reed felt it from where he stood, the understanding that this was not just about skill, it was about something that could not be trained on a screen or measured by a system. Whitaker nodded once, slowly, then turned back to Hayes, his gaze firm now, direct. This man kept aircraft in the air when there were no diagnostics. No backups, no guarantees, he said, each word deliberate. He did not rely on what a system told him. He relied on what the machine could not say out loud. Hayes swallowed hard, the image forming in his mind, not of an old man standing quietly on a runway, but of someone who had faced situations far beyond his understanding and solved them without hesitation, without recognition. Whitaker's voice softened slightly, but the authority never left it. "You saw a relic," he said. "I see the reason some of us are still here." The crew stood completely still now, no one shifting, no one speaking. The earlier laughter felt distant, almost unreal. Dalton did not react to the praise, did not acknowledge it. He simply looked back at the aircraft, as if the conversation was already over for him, as if the only thing that mattered had already been done. Whitaker followed his gaze, watching the engines run smooth and steady. Then he exhaled quietly, a small release of something that had been held for longer than anyone there could understand. "It still listens to you," he said, almost to himself. Dalton's eyes remained on the machine. "It always did," he answered, and in that moment, the difference between them became clear, not in rank, not in authority, but in experience, in history, in something that could not be replaced. Hayes felt it settle fully now, the complete shift from arrogance to understanding. And as he looked at Dalton again, He no longer saw an old man standing on the edge of relevance. He saw someone who had never left it, someone who had simply stepped aside until the moment demanded his return. And now that moment had passed, leaving behind a silence heavier than before, filled not with doubt, but with respect. The engines continued to run, steady and controlled, but the tension on the runway had shifted into something quieter, something that pressed inward instead of outward. And for the first time since the aircraft came back to life, Frank Dalton stepped away without looking back, as if the outcome had never been in question for him. His hand slipped the small wrench back into the worn leather pouch, the snap closing with a soft click that somehow carried more finality than the roar behind him. Colonel Whitaker watched him carefully, not with urgency, but with a kind of measured attention reserved for moments that do not repeat. "You are leaving," Whitaker said, not as a command, not even as a question, but as recognition. Dalton paused just long enough to acknowledge it, his posture unchanged. "I was only here because someone remembered," he replied, his voice low, steady, and that single sentence carried something deeper than explanation. It carried distance, years of it. Hayes felt the words land harder than anything else that had been said, because it meant this was not routine, not a scheduled fix, not an assignment. This was something pulled from the past and placed briefly into the present. Whitaker exhaled slowly, the weight of that truth settling in. "There are still people who remember," he said, and this time there was something closer to insistence in his tone. Dalton did not turn, but there was the slightest pause in his step, as if the words had reached him, but not enough to stop him completely. The crew remained still, no one daring to interrupt, no one willing to break the fragile balance that had replaced the earlier arrogance. Airman Reed watched closely, his instincts telling him this moment mattered more than the repair itself, that whatever happened next would define how this story lived beyond the runway. Whitaker took a step forward, closing the distance just slightly. "We could use someone like you," he added, not formally, not as an order, but as something more personal, something almost rare from a man of his rank. Dalton finally turned his head just enough for his profile to catch the light, the lines of his face worn but steady, his eyes distant, not dismissive, just far away. "You do not need me," he said, and there was no pride in it, no refusal, just a quiet certainty. "You have everything you built," he continued, "systems, teams, answers for everything." He paused, just for a second, "until you do not." The words hung there, unfinished but complete. Hayes felt a chill despite the heat, because he understood now that what Dalton offered was not something that could be scheduled or assigned. It was something that only appeared when everything else failed. Whitaker studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Not agreement, not defeat, but acknowledgement." "Then I hope we do not need you," he said quietly. Dalton gave no response to that. He simply adjusted the strap of his pouch and continued walking, each step carrying him farther from the aircraft, from the crew, from the moment that had just reshaped everything they thought they knew. The engines still roared behind him, but they no longer belonged to him. They belonged to the present, to the people who would now have to carry what they had just witnessed. Hayes remained where he stood, watching Dalton leave, the weight of his earlier words settling deeper with every step the old man took. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to speak, because there was nothing left to say that could change what had already been revealed. The distance between them grew with every step Dalton took, but the weight he left behind did not move. It settled deeper into the runway, into the men who stood there watching, into the hum of the engines that now felt different, no longer just machinery, but something understood in a way they had never considered before. Captain Hayes finally shifted, the rigid posture breaking as he took a slow breath, his eyes still fixed on the old man walking away. "Sir," he said, his voice quieter now, directed at Colonel Whitaker, but lacking the sharpness it once carried. Whitaker did not immediately respond. His gaze remained on Dalton as well, as if measuring something beyond distance. "You asked him to perform," Whitaker said after a moment, not turning, not raising his voice, just stating it again. But this time the words carried a different weight, not just what had happened, but what it meant. Hayes nodded once, slowly, the admission unspoken but clear. "I did not know," he added, but even as he said it, he understood how little that mattered now. Whitaker finally turned toward him, his expression calm, but not soft. "That is the problem," he said, not as a reprimand, but as a truth that stood on its own. Hayes looked down briefly, the earlier confidence replaced with something far more grounded, something that would not disappear as easily as it had formed. Behind them, the engineers had already begun moving again, cautiously, quietly, returning to their stations. But the energy had changed, the urgency replaced with care, with attention, every movement slower, more deliberate, as if they were now aware that the machine demanded more than just input and output. Reed stood near the edge of the group, his eyes shifting between Dalton and the aircraft, trying to hold on to the details of what he had just witnessed. Not just the actions, but the feeling of it, the precision, the certainty, the absence of doubt. Whitaker noticed him, just briefly, a glance that acknowledged the awareness in the young airman's posture. Then his attention returned forward. Dalton was nearing the far edge of the runway now, the heat waves swallowing his outline slightly, turning him into something less defined, something that could almost be mistaken for memory already. Hayes took a step forward, not fast, not urgent, just enough to close the gap between himself and Whitaker. "Sir," he said again, this time more certain. "What do we do now?" The question was not about the aircraft, not really. It was about everything that came after this moment. Whitaker considered it for a second, his gaze drifting back to the A-10, the engine still running smooth, the sound steady, reliable. "You listen," he said simply. Hayes frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in realization that the answer was not as straightforward as it sounded. Whitaker continued, "You stop looking only at what the system tells you, and you start paying attention to what it cannot." Hayes nodded slowly, the words settling in, reshaping something fundamental in how he approached everything he thought he understood. Reed took a small step closer, not interrupting, but clearly absorbing every word. Whitaker turned slightly, addressing both of them now without changing his tone. "Men like him do not leave instructions," he said. "They leave examples." The statement hung in the air, clear and complete. Hayes looked back toward where Dalton had been, but the old man was no longer clearly visible, just a fading figure beyond the heat, and for a moment, it felt like he had never been there at all, except for the one thing that proved he had, the steady, powerful hum of the aircraft behind them, a reminder that something impossible had just been made possible, not by force, not by protocol, but by understanding that could not be replaced. And as the sound carried across the base, Hayes felt the shift settle fully inside him, not as a lesson given, but as one earned, one that would stay long after the moment itself had disappeared. The runway did not return to normal. It settled into something quieter, something more aware, the kind of silence that follows when everyone realizes they have just witnessed something they cannot fully explain. The A-10 continued to idle with a steady, controlled hum, no longer a broken machine but a presence that demanded respect. Captain Hayes stood with his hands at his sides now, no longer crossed, no longer defensive, his posture reflecting a shift that words could not capture. He turned slowly toward the aircraft, studying it as if seeing it for the first time, not as a system of parts and diagnostics, but as something that required understanding beyond data. The engineers worked around it carefully, their movements precise, no longer rushed or confident in the way they had been before. Each glance at the aircraft carried a question now, not certainty. Airman Reed stepped closer to the open panel Dalton had touched, crouching slightly, his eyes tracing the edges, the screws, the placement, trying to find the exact detail that had made the difference. But it was not obvious, not visible in a way that could be easily taught or repeated. It was subtle, almost invisible, and that made it more powerful. Behind him, Colonel Whitaker remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the horizon where Dalton had disappeared. Then he turned back toward the crew, his presence drawing their attention without a single word. "Shut it down," he said calmly, and the instruction carried immediate action, not hesitation, not confusion. The crew moved quickly but with control, following procedure now with a different level of care. The engines began to wind down, the deep roar softening into a low vibration, then into silence once again. But this silence was not the same as before. It was not failure. It was controlled, understood. Hayes watched the shutdown process closely, noting every sound, Every change, his mind replaying what he had seen, what he had missed, what he had assumed. Whitaker stepped beside him, his voice low but clear. "What you saw today is not in any manual," he said. Hayes nodded slowly. "No, sir," he replied, his tone steady but changed. Whitaker continued, "And that is exactly why it matters." The word settled in, not as a warning, but as guidance. Reed stood up from the panel, looking back toward the colonel, then toward Hayes, the realization spreading across his face. This was not just about one aircraft. It was about how they approached everything moving forward. Whitaker looked at both of them, his gaze firm but measured. "You will not always have someone like him," he said. "So you learn from what you can while it is still in front of you." Hayes glanced once more toward the edge of the runway, where Dalton had vanished into the distance, and for a moment, he considered calling out, saying something, anything that might bridge the gap between what had been and what could be, but he did not move, because he understood now that some things were not meant to be called back. They were meant to be carried forward. Whitaker turned and began walking back toward the staff car, his role in the moment complete, but the impact of it still unfolding in the minds of those left behind. Reed remained near the aircraft, his eyes focused, his thoughts working through every detail, determined not to let the moment fade into something abstract. While Hayes stood in place, the weight of responsibility settling fully onto him, not as pressure, but as purpose. The runway stretched out before him, quiet now, but no longer empty, filled instead with the echo of something that had changed how he would see every machine, every system, every decision from that point forward. And as the last vibration of the engine faded into stillness, the lesson remained, not spoken, not written, but unmistakably clear. The runway was quiet now, not empty, but settled, like it had absorbed everything that had just happened and was still holding on to it. Captain Hayes stood beside the A-10, his eyes no longer searching for answers on a screen, but on the surface of the aircraft itself, tracing lines, panels, details he had seen 100 times before but never truly noticed. Airman Reed worked nearby, slower than usual, more deliberate, his hands moving with care as if every bolt and plate carried meaning beyond its function. The rest of the crew followed the same rhythm, no one rushing, no one speaking louder than necessary, because something had changed in how they understood their work. Colonel Whitaker was gone. The staff car long disappeared, but his words remained, not as orders, but as something heavier, something that stayed. Hayes reached out and rested his hand against the same section Dalton had touched, the metal warm from the sun, silent now, but no longer unreadable. He closed his eyes for a brief second, not in doubt, but in focus, trying to feel what Dalton had felt, trying to listen the way he had been told. And while nothing spoke back, something shifted, a different kind of awareness, a pause before assumption, a question before conclusion. He stepped back slowly, exhaling as he opened his eyes. "Run the check again," he said, his voice steady, but different, the tone of command still there, now grounded in something deeper. Reed nodded immediately, moving to the console, but this time, his eyes did not stay on the screen. They moved between the data and the aircraft, connecting, comparing, thinking. The crew adjusted with him, following the same approach without needing to be told. And for the first time that day, the process felt complete, not just executed, but understood. The aircraft remained still, waiting, no longer a problem to solve, but a system to respect. Hayes glanced once more toward the far end of the runway, where Dalton had disappeared, but there was nothing there now. No figure, no movement, just heat waves rising into the distance. And yet the absence felt full, like something had been left behind on purpose, something that did not need a name or a record to exist. Hayes straightened, his posture firm, not from pride, but from clarity. The lesson had settled fully now, not as a memory of what happened, but as a way forward. He turned back to the aircraft, his focus sharp, his approach changed, and as the sun continued to press down on the runway, the silence held, not empty, not uncertain, but steady, carrying a truth that did not need to be spoken out loud, that some knowledge is not written, not stored, not taught in manuals. It is lived, carried, and when the moment comes, it reveals itself without asking for recognition, leaving behind only one thing that truly matters, understanding that cannot be forgotten.